Okay, so the first thing to start is, and this becomes a recurring theme throughout it, or a device that he uses, is he opens in the name of God, the gracious and merciful. So, and then he says, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. The reason that is significant is because he uses the origin, the unity of them as Aramaic religions, both Judaism and Islam, as a unifying factor throughout. So that he establishes that from the beginning. Okay, so that's something to make note of.
Can you say that again?
Okay, so again he starts with in the name of God, the gracious and merciful, and that's significant because of the fact that that sets a tone.
Oh, okay.
So the as we go through, he says, and again establishes right from the beginning, one of the main concepts within his text is that idea of peace. Peace and the mercy of God Almighty be upon you, and may peace be for us all. God willing, peace for us all on the Arab land and in Israel as well, and in every part of this big world, which is so complex by its sanguinary conflicts. I'm probably saying that wrong, but that's bloodshed. Okay. Disturbed by its sharp contradictions, menaced now and then by destructive wars launched by man to annihilate his fellow man. So there's that rule of three there, because there's those three conceptual things, not just three words, but three longer clauses employed there. And really, the purpose is from the beginning, right from the beginning, from him establishing that he here comes in peace. Now, the significance of that is obviously that this is a man who was leading a war against this country 4 years prior. Okay, so it's very important that he establishes that sense of peace and the fact that the purpose of peace coming through. Finally, amidst the ruins of what the man has built and remains the victims of mankind, there emerges neither victor nor vanquished. The only vanquished remains man, God's most sublime creation, man whom God has created, as Gandhi, the apostle of peace, puts it, to forge ahead, to mold the way of life and worship God Almighty. So that religious illusion running all the way through, right from that, we're still in that first paragraph.
Is it intertextuality with Gandhi?
The Gandhi is a significant person, allusion to a significant person. You can look at the Gandhi as for either looking at logos or ethos within it. Okay, because he's drawing upon an historical figure and someone who is renowned. And so he then starts. If he looks at, there's a contrast between the idea of that ruins that man has built to the start of the next paragraph, where he says, "I come today to you on solid ground, to shape a new life, to establish peace." So there is still hope. There's a solid groundwork here that exists because we're becoming talking of peace. There's that inclusivity in the use of we all. And he names the major religions, and again they share the Aramaic tradition. Muslims, Christians, and Jews worship God and no one but God. God's teachings and commandments are love, sincerity, purity, and peace. And so in that establishes a moral argument, because he's saying and draws upon the fact that it is a religion and being aware of his audience. As I stated before, in the contextual aspects of it, Israel is quite a religious country, a fundamentally religious country in a lot of ways, and becoming more so. And the same within the nations surrounding it, so Egypt, Syria, Jordan, all the countries that surround Israel, Lebanon. And there is that, and he draws upon all of those in that inclusivity there. He then acknowledges the fact that there's people within the room who would be upset that he's talking about them, okay? And he talks about the fact that in his own place or his own country, it was met with some chagrin. He quotes from people around him saying, "Mr. President, what would be our reaction if Israel should actually extend an invitation to you?" I replied calmly, "I will accept it immediately. I've declared that I will go to the end of the world. I will go to Israel, for I want to put before the people of Israel all the facts." So that's establishing himself as a leader, a voice of leadership within the issue, and acknowledging the angst that is evident still on both sides. And yep, no.
So why did he invade or
So we went through this last on the context of it last lesson, okay? But so that in terms of the contextual concerns is Israel as a country was established in and around a place that already had a country established. It was rejected by the nations surrounding it. Israel has expanded its borders, and the people around, the nations around that, and we'll make a mention of this later, refer to Israel as so-called Israel. They don't acknowledge it as the country. Okay, and so there's been the Arab League of Nations around it fundamentally reject the idea of Israel. And so, but then he brings it down in the line there that is important is, I will go to Israel for what I want to put before the people of Israel all the facts. So he's drawing this, it's not just an emotional argument. He's suggesting that this then is a factual one as well. And what he was, the inference being that perhaps they haven't heard the true story or the full side of the story, and that's his job. So the first part is really establishing where he wants to go with this argument.
Would you say that's logos?
Yeah, I would say there's an element of logos there as well. The establishment of it, yeah. I can see the point of all those who were astounded by my decision, of those who had doubts as to the sincerity of the intentions. No one ever can see that the president of the biggest Arab state, which bears the heaviest burden of the top responsibility. So again, he's setting up the enormity of this. And so he says, rather, we are still bearing the consequences of 4 fierce wars waged within 30 years. The families of the 1973 October War are still moaning under the cruel pains of widowhood and bereavement of sons, fathers, and brothers. So there's that emotional and moral argument coming back to it as well. He's acknowledging that, yes, these wars have occurred. He can understand the fact that there was some hesitation for him as in his role speaking before this group, but he is presenting an emotional response because he's saying that there's still those people who are grieving, and this is for them as well. Then we have an acknowledgement that there is a real. He's moving away from some of the stuff that the other Arab states have declared in their positions, and he's speaking as the president of Egypt, separate from that as a body. So those of you who contact me following the declaration of this decision express their objection because the feeling of utter suspicion, absolute lack of confidence between the Arab states and the Palestinian people on the one hand and Israel on the other. It is sufficient to say that many months in which peace could have been brought have been wasted over differences and fruitless discussions on the procedure of the convocation of the Geneva Conference, all showing utter suspicion and absolute lack of confidence. So he's placed there, it's quite a brave thing, he's placing some blame for this, not just on the Arab states, but also within Israel as a nation, saying that the suspicion from both sides, and this is a movement to try and rectify some of that suspicion. There's a use of some informality within the sense, and also direct speech when he says to be absolutely frank with you, setting himself, and the purpose of that is setting himself and showing himself to be an honest person. Okay, I took this decision after long thinking, knowing that it constitutes a grave risk. For if God Almighty had made my fate to assume the responsibility on behalf of the Egyptian people, blah, 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 the main duty dictated by the responsibility is to exhaust all and every means in my bid to save my Egyptian Arab people and the entire Arab nation the horrors of new, shocking, and destructive wars. So rule of 3 there, new, shocking, and destructive wars, dimension of which are unforeseen by no other than God himself. So he then says, again, you could argue this within the Logos as well as even ethos or pathos, when he says that he's taken on board the moral complexity of this decision, acknowledging the suspicion that exists within the Arab people, the broader Arab people of the Israeli nation, But he says that he's taking on board because if his role is, I'm taking on this risk because my role as a leader says that we need to avoid these wars, and I need to go through all means possible. And this is and the purpose of this, he's setting up the gravity of the situation. He's setting up the gravity of his role and the importance of them listening to him as well, because he's showing that he's willing to come and listen to them as well. Okay, so that's important. It sets up like a moral right, a moral kind of aspect to his response. Now, if we move down just a little bit, we're going to just skip one paragraph, but ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in the life of nations and peoples when it is incumbent on those known for their wisdom and clarity of vision to overlook the past with all its complexities and weighing memories in a bold drive towards new horizons. So this is a point of contrast for the other speeches, one thing you might look at. So he's calling upon there needs to be, and later on he acknowledges it, but we need to see it and move beyond it. Okay, we need to look past that. Those who, like us, are shouldering the same responsibility entrusted to us are the first who should have the courage to take fate-determining decisions which are in consonance with the circumstances. We must all rise above all forms of fanaticism, self-deception, and obsolete theories of superiority. So again, that rule of three, which is a consistent use throughout. The most important thing is to never forget that the infallibility is the prerogative of God alone. That religious aspect used there, and religious aspect used as a real sense of logos, because he's speaking to people who are religious, and so if you're taking on that board as a factual statement that God alone is infallible, then what he's saying to them is that we need to acknowledge that we make mistakes. We are infallible. We are not infallible, rather. And it is our responsibility to acknowledge that as leaders. It is our responsibility to see that we need to move beyond where we are now. And that said, in the next one, if I said that I wanted to save all the Arab people the horrors of shocking and destructive wars, I most sincerely declare before you that I have the same feeling and bear the same responsibility towards all and every man on earth, and certainly towards the Israeli people. Now, that's a huge statement. There's a lot of gravity in that statement. And a word that you might want to use earlier is gravitas. He sets gravitas, so he sets himself as a leader, someone worthy of listening to, because of his acknowledgement of what's happened past. Grativas. I wish that was on record because I'm not sure if that's right. Damn it. Yes. Mr. Conway spelled it right. Now, but it's that sense of like a real presence and a figure, and in his acknowledgement of the gravity of the role, he's setting up gravitas to himself as a speaker. In that.
Really quick. I'm still writing down.
Okay, so like in by establishing the real stakes that are at play, and the fact that he was brave enough to do it, because if he talks about like people have said to me and I still was willing to do it, he's setting up that sense of gravitas. Okay, he's a speaker worth listening to in that respect. And so the sincerity in that statement where he says that it's towards the Israeli people as well, he's really saying that we're equal as people and both lives are valuable, which is important because he then challenges later on in the speech, as I'm sure you saw when you read, he challenges a notion that exists within, or was seen to exist within Israel, that the Palestinian people were less than the Israelis. Okay? Any life lost in war is a human life. And there's that unity that sets between the two, being that of an Israeli or an Arab. A wife who becomes a widow is a human being entitled to a happy family life, whether she is an Arab or an Israeli. Innocent children, and so again he lists these as he goes through. So if we move down a little bit, so obviously when you read through that, you can see that he's talking about that, just the responsibility to the morals and the safety of others. And so then he finishes that with, again, I've taken my decision to come to you despite all hazards to deliver my address. I have shouldered the prerequisites of the historical responsibility, and therefore I declared on February 1971 to be precise, I'm willing to sign a peace agreement with Israel. That was the first declaration made by a responsible Arab official since the outbreak of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is important. Again, it sets credence to what he's saying. He's setting up an argument that he has a history and a proven track record of trying to seek peace. And then the real reckoning of peace coming through, this idea of peace. But then the next point, which is really important as well, is he starts to introduce the concept of justice. Peace based on justice, not just on a ceasefire. So he's making a distinction between that. So, and that's important because part of the conflict that exists within it is that there's armed occupation of Palestinian land. Is one of the driving forces of the conflict within the area. And so he's saying that peace needs to exist where it's not monitored by the gun. That's not true peace. Peace needs to be built on justice and a true understanding of the value of people. And so in the line when he says, and he introduced this concept where he says, motivated by all these factors, dictated by the responsibilities of leadership, I called on for an international conference to establish permanent peace based on justice. I was not in the position of he who was pleading for peace or asking for a ceasefire. Motivated by all these factors, dictated by duties of history and leadership, we agreed the first disengagement agreement. And so the we is the unity between the Israelis and the Egyptians and the Arab League, again showing that this that aspect that it can happen. Then we proceeded trying both open and closed doors in a bid to find a certain path leading to a durable and just peace. Again, just repeated. We open our hearts to the peoples of the entire world to make them understand our motivations and objectives and to leave them actually convinced of the fact that we are advocates of justice and peacemakers. So I don't have to say it again, but again, justice coming through as an idea. And so, again, he's coming to this establishment of his reasoning for being there. Motivated by these factors, I decided to come to you with an open mind and an open heart and with a conscious determination so that we might establish permanent peace based on justice. So it's very clear that he sets up the purpose of this speech. And the first part of this speech is really justifying his right to come to this point, as well as setting up a logical argument for it in the sense that he's appealing not only to the emotions and morals, but saying we are united by some things anyway, and let's move towards that. And it's important. Oh, sorry, one second. I'll come back. It's important, and I'm not going to hop on too much, but it really is that important that he's establishing it that it's peace, but it's a just peace, and what a just peace means that he's saying it's not just on the Israeli terms. This is a peace, a justice. There's a peace. There's a human justice that exists between all members concerned. Sorry, Rochelle, what are you saying?
No, is that anaphora when they're saying motivated by all these factors and blah blah blah?
Yeah, so motivated. Yeah, sorry, that's a good point. Yeah, so you can use these. That's anaphora there. So the repetition of the clause. Yep.
Could you also say develop a sense of logos because he's always referring back to history with very factual things?
So definitely he can. So you can say that he establishes logos through that drawing upon historical things, but he also establishes logos by how he employs ethos. Because how he draws upon the moral component of it as well.
I was just thinking because when he says on the 4th of February 1971, 16th October.
Yep. So historical illusions, historical facts, and I would make definitely that's a fact that he uses. And it's important to draw upon because right at the beginning he says present the facts, and then he uses factual statements as well. It is so fated that my trip to you, the trip of peace, should coincide with the Islamic feast, the holy feast of something. The feast sacrifice when Abraham, peace be upon him, great-grandfather of the Arabs and Jews, submitted to God. So he's drawing upon a biblical story where Abraham offers up his son, but is stopped by God. Everyone know that story? Yep. And so there's a unity that. So in the Islamic text and the Quran, there's very common, as you would know, there's common stories between that and the Old Testament. Okay, great submitted to God. I say when God Almighty ordered him and to him Abraham went with dedicated sentiments, not out of weakness, but through a great spiritual force and by a free will to sacrifice his very own son, prompted by a firm and unshakable belief in ideals that lend life to a profound significance. So he's saying that he's showing that this is the same. We believe in the sacrifice of God. This is the time in which I'm presenting to you is around that where we're celebrating this sacrifice, and let us move forward with that in our mind. Okay, this coincidence may carry a new meaning to us all, which may become a genuine aspiration because we're moving forward with free will, a firm and unshakable belief in ideals. So he's saying we're moving forward with this firm and unshakable belief in ideals, and the ideals that he's alluding to are justice and peace. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be frank with each other using straightforward words and a clear conception with no ambiguity. Let us be frank with each other today while the entire world, both East and West, follows these unparalleled moments that could prove to be a radical turning point in the history of each part of the world. And afore again, let us be frank, let us be frank. So he's talking about honesty, and he sets it out from the beginning. Let's be frank with each other as we answer the important question: how can we achieve permanent peace based on justice? And so he sets out that question. He questions to the audience the rhetorical question that he then will go seat forward to try and answer. So there's some element of that Socratic.
Margaret Atwood.
There's a similarity within that Margaret Atwood structure. Yep.
When he says to be frank, repetition of that, would that be like an attempt to like take away his title in that section of the speech to better engage with his audience, whereas he's coming to them not as some separate entity, but as like a person trying to.
Good. Yeah. He humanizes himself. Yeah, we are. That's beyond in human emotion and people of faith, because he's attached that before. Okay.
Yeah.
So in our role as not just leaders and wise people, but people of faith and people of the nation, of the area, that we need to be frank with each other. We need to be honest with each other, because honesty is the only thing that's going to lead to peace. Yep.
So you'd say he starts off as a very like a figurehead, then brings himself down to that kind of bystander level where he shares their ideologies and their thoughts, and then towards the end of the speech he brings himself back up as this is the plan we all agree on, and this is what we plan to enact.
Yeah, so there's elements of that. Those are transitions within it. So he does very much establish himself as a figurehead, establish himself as very much a representative of Egypt, but then also as a human and a shared human belief with those around him, and moving forward to talking about bless you, in order to establish that sense of justice as well. Okay, so he says, I come to you carrying my clear and frank answer to this big question. So he sets out what is the question, but then he comes forward and says, I believe I have the answer to it. So that the people in Israel as well as the whole world might hear it, and so that all those devoted prayers ring in my ears, pleading to God Almighty that this historic meeting may eventually lead to the results aspired by millions, might also hear it. Okay? Again, setting the context of it, religious unity between them. But then he says, again, he's established that it needs to be frank. We need to agree that it needs to be frank. And so then, and he started right at the beginning that he said, I need to be honest. And so before I move on, I'm basing myself on a number of facts which no one can deny. So my answer is based on these facts. And in order for us to move forward in real peace, these facts need to be our facts, is essentially what he's saying.
Logo.
Okay? So the first fact, no one can build his happiness at the expense of the misery of others. The second fact, never have I spoken or will ever speak in two languages. Never have I adopted or will adopt two policies. I will never deal with anyone except in one language, one policy, and with one face. So what he's looking at that is within that nation, within the Palestinian people being able to speak within their own language and govern themselves within their own language, and their right to do so. Okay. The third fact, direct confrontation in a straight line are the nearest and most successful methods to a clear objective. Yep.
Sorry. Just going back to that second factor, would you be able to argue that, like, by saying two languages, he's kind of been implying that he means like he'll never contradict himself with two policies?
Does that? Yeah. So he was saying I'm not going to be speaking to two, and that is a good point. I'm not going to be speaking two-faced about this. What I'm saying to you now is
show transparency.
yeah, there's transparency establishes that aspect of transparency. But I would also make the link to the Palestinian people as well. The third fact, direct confrontation, we've said that. The fourth fact, the call for permanent and just peace based on respect for the United Nations resolutions. Now, part of this is drawing links to historical issues, United Nations declarations of or resolutions of where the borders should be and what the role of Israel should have within the different nations. There was some criticism as to where they're actually being adhered to. And that, you've got to be careful with this because in terms of how it reads and who your audience is when you're running, but there is some criticism of the way in which the Israelis have responded and respected United Nations protocols today as well. Okay, so it's an ongoing issue, but I'm not sure if you'd actually include that in there, depending on the notion of the question. So it has become the call of the whole world. It has become a clear expression of the will of the international community, whether in public official capitals, where policies are made and decisions taken, or at the level of public opinion, which influences policy making and decision taking. So he's really challenged. That is a form of a challenge to the Israeli leaders, saying that you need to follow these policies, you need to adhere to them as well. The fifth fact, and this is probably the cleanest and most prominent, is that the Arab nation, in its drive for permanent peace based on justice, does not proceed with a position of weakness or hesitation, but has the potential of power and stability, which tells of a sincere will for peace. The Arab declared intention stems from an awareness prompted by a heritage of civilization that, to avoid inevitable disaster that will befall us, you and the entire world, there is no alternative to the establishment of permanent peace based on justice, peace that is not shaken by storms, swayed by suspicion, or jeopardized by ill intentions. So the fourth fact really calls upon the Israeli people to take heed of the declarations that have existed and the understanding that is being established throughout the world. But the fifth fact is call upon the Arab nation to make sure that they adhere to peace. And there's metaphor there, peace that is not shaken by storms, swayed by suspicion, or jeopardized by ill intentions. That employment of the figurative language they used to highlight the fact that the Arab people or the Arab nations surrounding them have in the past been overly suspicious. Any breakdown of peace has led to a reaction. So he's saying that both sides, that fourth and fifth fact, calls upon both sides to take responsibility. Yep.
Would you then link it with contextually after this, Egypt was kicked out of the Arab League, the Arab nation?
It depends. Yeah, you can. It depends on the nature of the question, but we'll go through that. That's an important thing that we be aware of that as well. Okay. So after, as I said to you last lesson, after this, the Egyptians were kicked out of the Arab League of Nations, so they didn't take it on board. Okay. So it's
They were insulted.
now the Arab League of Nations. Okay. In light of these facts, which I mean to place before you the way I see them, I would also wish to warn you in all sincerity. I warn you against some thoughts that could cross your minds. Frankness makes it incumbent upon me to tell you the following. And so again, he goes through some other things and the reason that this is important is he's setting out a shared understanding. It's he's trying to create an argument that is a unifying one and acknowledge. And so you could make a link to Keating and Pearson in this because of the fact that he's saying that you need to make those acknowledgements of the past and the truths in order to move forward. Okay, he says the only difference would be that ultimately they're there when we need to just acknowledge and move past them. Okay, but ultimately he needs to say that you would link it not through history but a shared understanding, and he's saying that we need to come to this shared understanding. First, I have not come here from a separate agreement between Egypt and Israel. This is not part of the policy of Egypt. This is a problem. The problem is not that of Egypt and Israel. Any separate peace between Egypt and Israel, between any confrontation state and Israel, will not bring permanent peace based on justice in the entire region. Rather, even if peace between all the confrontation states and Israel were achieved, in the absence of a just solution to the Palestinian problem, never will there be a durable and just peace upon which the entire world insists today. So, the important thing to understand within that is he's saying the Egyptian people are not just concerned about their relationship with Israel. The Egyptian people and the Arab people as a whole are really concerned with the way in which the Palestinian people are treated within Israel. Okay, and that is something that is true today. Okay, it's very, very true today. Second, I've not come to you to seek a partial peace, namely to terminate the state of belligerency at this date, but put off the entire problem to a subsequent stage. This is not the radical solution that would steer us to permanent peace. Equally, I have not come to you for a third disengagement agreement in Sinai or in the Golan and the West Bank, for this would mean that we're merely delaying the ignition of the fuse. Metaphor there. It would mean that we are lacking the courage to confront peace and that we're too weak to shoulder the burdens and responsibilities of a durable peace based on justice. Okay, so again, he really highlights the ideas that he's putting forward. His role, so his understandings of what is important in driving peace. He makes references to specific historical events and places within Sinai, Golan, and the West Bank, subjects of disagreements that exist. And so it's just that if we do this and we're looking at it, the fuse being that it's going to blow up, and if we don't actually deal with it. I've come to you so that together we might build a durable peace based on justice to avoid the shedding of one single drop of blood from an Arab or an Israeli. It is for this reason that I have proclaimed my readiness to go to the farthest corner of the world. Here I would come back to the answer to the big question: how can we achieve a durable peace based on justice? There's a repetition of that question. And so in terms of how you might talk about that, he presents the question to begin with. He then establishes the base of understanding that is required if we are to actually answer the question, and then comes back to the question. Okay, so very much it's very important if you're talking about the structural forms of the text. In my opinion, I declare to the whole world from this forum, the answer is neither difficult nor impossible, despite years of feud, blood vengeance, spite and hatred, and breeding generations of concepts of total rift and deep-rooted animosity. The answer is not difficult, nor is it impossible, if we sincerely and faithfully follow a straight line. The idea of we and unity there is important, because it's, again, the responsibility is placed on both. The first point that he says is that I tell you, we welcome you among us with the full of security and safety. So, you is the Israeli people, the Israeli nation, and it's a significant point because he's acknowledging them as a country. And so in the one before, the one underneath, he says, we used to reject you. We had our reasons and our claims, yes. We used to brand you as so-called Israel, yes. We were together in international conferences and organizations, and our representatives did not and still do not exchange greetings, yes. This has happened and is still happening. So that acknowledgement of what has happened, what is happening, and his acknowledgement of the importance of that. Because if the response from the Israeli people to the people around them is obviously going to be one of suspicion and fear, if those people around them don't even acknowledge their right to exist. Okay, and that's an important thing. That's an important acknowledgement that he has made. And so he goes through what has happened in the previous one. I'm not going to read all those through. But if you look down the next one, he goes, and it starts, yet today I tell you and declare to the whole world that we accept to live with you in permanent peace based on justice. And that's, so the movement he is examining or exploring here is a movement away from a rejection of them as a nation to an understanding that we need to move forward with peace based on justice. So it says from yet today I tell you. Also shows acknowledgement of the significance of the situation by placing himself in that whole world. That's okay. So he understands that the whole world is watching this because the consequences flowing on. We do not want to encircle you or be encircled ourselves by destructive missiles ready for launching, nor the shells of grudges and hatred. Shells by grudges and hatred, again, metaphor.
As in warfare?
Yep. Okay. And so the grudges and hatred are a weapon. They're destructive in nature, just as the missiles that are ready to launch is what he's saying there. The next one that we're going to move down is then when he says, there was a huge war between us, which he tried to build up over a quarter of the century, but it was destroyed in 1973. It was a wall of continuously inflammable and escalating psychological warfare. It was a wall of fear of the force that would sweep the entire Arab nation. It was a wall of propaganda, and we were a nation reduced to emotional corpse. Obviously, that's an extended metaphor within that. There's a figurative wall as well as a literal wall that they built. Okay, so it starts with there was a huge wall. And so important because obviously acknowledging again the past, but talking about the impact that had them on as a nation. Rather, some of you have gone as far as to say that even after 50 years, the Arabs would not regain any strength. It was a wall that threatened it always with the long arm that could reach and strike anywhere. It was a wall that warned us against extermination and annihilation if we tried to use our legitimate right to liberate the occupied territories. Together, we have to admit that the wall fell and collapsed in 1973. So, 1973 then as a watershed moment, he's highlighting it and so that the wall that exists, the figurative wall that he's talking about, the one that talks about their capacity to, their access to nuclear weapons, their capacity to, and we know this through the contextual concerns of their understanding of their support from the military might of superpowers, that once they through the war and the taking back of some of those disputed areas, okay, that's the ending of that, and we need to. And he then says, and it's important, if we tried to use our legitimate right to liberate the occupied territories, legitimate right, that's a contentious point there because he's saying that you're occupying our land and we're taking it back. He puts the moral emphasis, like the right on them. Yet there remained another wall. This wall constitutes a psychological barrier between us, a barrier of suspicion, a barrier of rejection, a barrier of fear and deception, a barrier of hallucinations around any action, deed, or decision, a barrier of cautious and erroneous interpretations of all and every event or statement. It is this psychological barrier which I described in official statements as representing 70% of the whole problem. Okay, so he says that we need to acknowledge that this wall exists, okay, that this wall is there. And it becomes a motif right within it because it's used so much, but it's or you can talk about it as an extended metaphor. Either way is fine. And so he's talking about that's what needs to be destroyed. This movement we need to go. Today, through my visit, I ask you, why don't we stretch our hands with faith and sincerity so that together we might destroy this barrier? Okay, appealing to them through the use of a rhetorical question. Why shouldn't ours and your will meet with faith and sincerity so that together we might remove all suspicion of fear, betrayal, and ill intentions? So that idea of faith then as well, because at the beginning, remember, it comes back to this establishment of the notion of them as unified in faith anyway. Okay. Why don't we stand together with the bravery of men and the boldness of heroes who dedicate themselves to a sublime objective? Why don't we stand together with the same courage and boldness to erect a huge edifice of peace that builds and does not destroy? An edifice that is a beacon for generations to come, the human message for construction, development, and the dignity of man. Why should we bequeath to the coming generations the plight of bloodshed, death, orphans, widowhood, family disintegration, and the wailing of victims? So that's really, really powerful stuff when you think about it there. Okay, he comes through and he says, why don't we move to peace? Why don't we do this? Because the alternative is this. Why would we? Why should we bequeath to the coming generations these things? If we do not move towards peace, then this is the consequence. So that's a really, really important point. Then draws upon a biblical text. Why don't we believe in the wisdom of God conveyed to us through the Proverbs of Solomon? Deceit is in the heart of them that imagine evil, but to the counselors of peace is joy. Better is a dry morsel and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifices with strife. Why don't we repeat together with the psalm from the Psalms of David? And so he draws upon these different aspects of their interwoven faith, and talks and uses it to talk about like justify what he's talking about and justify what he's going through, and advocating rather. And then comes back to it again when he says, to tell you the truth, peace cannot be its name unless it's based on justice and not on the occupation of the land of others. And that's a really, really important point because, as I said to you before, that's a real sticking point within the relationship between the two. With all the frankness and with the spirit that has prompted me to come to you today, I tell you, you have to give up once and for all the dreams of conquest and to give up the belief that force is the best method of dealing with the Arabs. You should clearly understand and assimilate the lesson of confrontation between you and us. So, again, there's that he calls upon an action from their audience. Okay, he's calling upon them to say that they need to move beyond any expansion of their territory because that is the thing that drives that can't be abided by because it is unjust.
Is that like indicating in that he's calling on the audience to action?
Yes. Okay. So it depends, and so that's one of the ways you can make those links within it. Okay. Ultimately, all speeches call upon some form of action. Okay, and challenge the responder to think about a new idea or something. And so maybe even if that action is just actually thinking about something in a new way, it's part of it as well. I can tell you guys are having so much fun, but we're just trying to get through it as quick as possible. Now, and while the reason that, and I just want to make clear, the reason that this is probably a little bit taking longer than the other ones is because I know that a lot of you aren't really up to date with the contextual stuff about it. Okay, so that's why we have to go through it a little bit more. All right. We move down to what is peace for Israel. It means that Israel lives in the region with her Arab neighbors in security and safety. To such logic, I say yes. It means that Israel lives within her borders, secure against any aggression. To such logic, I say yes. It means that Israel obtains all kinds of guarantees. Okay, so he establishes what peace would mean for Israeli people, and that's important because he's saying the bargaining that I'm presenting to you is that if you don't try and get further advances within your territory, then we ourselves will acknowledge you as having a right to live within that. In short, then, when we ask what is peace for Israel, the answer would be is that Israel lives with her borders and her Arab neighbors in safety and security within the framework of all the guarantees she accepts and which are offered to the other party. But how can this be achieved? How can we reach this conclusion, which will lead us to permanent peace based on justice? And then he says these are the things that we insist on. Okay, we insist on it. There's high modality within that language, and that's important. While he comes talking about peace, he comes with a strength of character that is existed within this. So there are facts to face of courage and clarity. These are Arab territories which Israel has occupied with armed forces. We insist that on complete withdrawal from these territories, including Arab Jerusalem. And again, that's a real sticking point. Okay, I've come to Jerusalem as the city of peace, which will always remain as a living embodiment of coexistence among believers of the three religions. Okay, and within Jerusalem, it is a significant holy city within the three religions. Okay, and so it's important. And so he's saying that it's a city of peace and it becomes a symbol of that. So Jerusalem then becomes a symbol of it as well. And so he makes historical allusion within the paragraph that starts, above all, the city should not be severed from those who've made it their abode for centuries. So what happened within Jerusalem? There's a lot of the Arab people were not allowed in parts of Jerusalem. Okay, and so the taking over within the Palestine. Okay, and the destruction of that. So he's saying that he makes historical allusion in that sentence because he makes links to the Crusaders. Now, the Crusades, as you would know, everyone knows what the Crusades were.
The rainbows. Oh, it's when the Christians killed everyone.
The rainbows. Yeah, sorry. The Christians, yes. So the Christians went to take back Jerusalem from the Arabs. Okay, and there was real destruction of the Arab people there. Okay, and so the same that would happen. He's saying that by doing this, by ostracizing the Arab people from that, you're calling upon that spirit rather than, and he brings spirit of tolerance and respect. The holy shrines of Islam and Christianity are not only places of worship, but a living testimony to our uninterrupted presence here politically, spiritually, and intellectually. And this is important because part of the an argument that was used is that notion that the Palestinians weren't there. And so there are some people who, and it's really hard to get into because it can become quite contentious, but the Israeli people or members of the right of Israeli forces and things would say that the Palestinians weren't actually here. They don't actually belong here. This is ours. Whereas he's saying that it is a fact that they've existed throughout the centuries, and you need to acknowledge that they existed there. Okay. There is that link there as well. Okay. Okay. So we go through the any talk about permanent peace based on justice and any move to ensure our coexistence in peace and security in this part of the world will become meaningless while you occupy Arab territories by force of arms. For there is no peace that could be in consonance with or built on the occupation of the land of others. Otherwise, it would not be a serious peace. And that's an important point again, because he sets up the parameters of what just peace is and what a peace that is justice, or just rather, is by saying that it needs to have, you need to acknowledge this and you need to move away from this. And in the point that he goes to, as for the Palestinians' cause, nobody could deny that this is the crux of the entire problem. Nobody in the world except today slogans propagated here in Israel ignoring the existence of the Palestinian people and questioning their whereabouts. The cause of the Palestinian people and their legitimate rights are no longer ignored or denied today by anybody. Rather, nobody has the ability or judgment that can deny or ignore it. So he's saying, again, the real precursors to peace are the removal of the Israeli people from the occupied nations and an acknowledgement of the rights of the Palestinian people to exist within their lands. Okay, and that's a really, really important point. Because he's coming, and it shows a bravery and a conviction within him as a leader and as a speaker, because he's coming before the Israelis speaking this. He's in their parliament speaking this. So if you think about the makeup of the parliament, and as I've told you, that there is a substantial far right within the Israeli parliament that would believe the stuff that's been promoted about, and the propaganda that suggested that the Palestinian people have no right to that land. Even the United States, your first ally, which is absolutely committed to safeguard Israel's security and existence. I say even the United States is up to face up to reality and facts and admit the Palestinian people are entitled to legitimate rights, and the Palestinian problem is the core and essence of the conflict, and that so long as it continues to be unresolved, the conflict will continue to aggravate, reaching new dimensions. Okay, so that's really, again, I keep saying it's really important, but it is, because what it is he's saying that this is the point of the argument. This is the center point of the argument. Now, we are almost finished, and my throat's hurting. But what we're going to do is next lesson we will finish it off. And in actual fact, because there's only three to go, I'll do the last three, okay, and I'll record it and chuck it up as 2 parts, okay? So, but I really need you to go through it in class, okay? At home, go through it. The next thing that next speech that we'll move to is
On not winning a Nobel Prize?
no, we'll go to on not winning the Nobel Prize. I apologize. I didn't want to say it because Tori said it.
His speech for actually winning a Nobel Prize? No, he won. That was his speech that he said when he won his Nobel Prize.
Oh, did he think he was going to lose?
I don't know. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.